Okay. Okay. Great, Callum. Yes. Okay. Let's keep in the conference with Amanda Smith. She is postdoc in the University of Chicago in the Callum's lab, and she works with biomechanics and works with finite element models in great apples, right? Yes. So welcome to have you here, Amanda, and have a good lecture, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about finite element modeling of the chimpanzee mandible. So mandibles are one of the most common skeletal elements found in the fossil record, and their morphology really varies quite a lot. Mandibles are often used as diagnostically to define species, to test phylogenetic hypotheses, and to infer the dietary ecology of species. And although shape differences such as tooth row divergence, some physio cross-sectional area, and slope have been well documented, for example, in East African fossil hominins like Australopithecus anamensis and afarensis, as we see here. The mechanical consequences of that variation is not well understood. So in order to understand how diet is related to morphology in fossil species, we need to study these relationships in living species. And if we're interested in fossil hominins, it makes sense to study the morphology of their closest living ancestors, the extant great apes. And although previous work has related diet to mandibular morphology using beam models, we have the opportunity to broaden our understanding of how the jaw functions under different loading conditions by simulating different behaviors using virtual techniques such as finite element analysis. FE modeling is a powerful tool, and once we build our models, it allows us to be able to conduct virtual experiments that simulate different feeding behaviors by changing our loading conditions and our boundary conditions. And this technique, importantly, is also non-destructive and lets us examine full field strains in an entire mandible. So I'll quickly explain finite element analysis, although I expect that most of you know what it is and we'll be hearing quite a lot about it. Finite element analysis is an engineering technique that's used to examine how objects of complex design respond to loads. So in this slide, you see a schematic. You see 3 cubes with forces applied to them. In the cube on the left, it has simple geometry, and stresses and strains can be calculated in it. But in objects with more complex geometry, like the one you see in the center, stresses and strains can be difficult or even impossible to calculate. But by dividing that morphology up into many small elements of uniform size, those stresses and strains can be approximated with that simple geometry. My work uses finite element analysis to test the underlying mechanical hypotheses about feeding function by modeling craniofacial structures of extinct and extant hominins. So ultimately, if we're interested in questions like, what are the mechanical consequences of mandibular shape variation in and within extinct and extant taxa? And what are the mechanical considerations and consequences of mandibular shape variation within extant taxa? Then we need a comparative data set of FE models. So I'm currently working on building this data set with specimens from Pan, Pongo, Homo, and Gorilla. But the work that I'm going to be talking about today is going to just focus on the chimpanzees. So here you can see some of the completed FE models that I've been working on. We have Pan on the left and Pongo in the center and one modern human on the right. They're not to scale here. So there's a rich literature on experimental work on primate feeding, and that includes in vivo bone strain studies and muscle architecture studies, and also studies on feeding behavior. Thus, as a first step in evaluating the results of our FE modeling, we should begin by comparing our models to these published experimental data to see whether they exhibit similar mechanical performance when subjected to equivalent loading conditions. Namely, the initial comparison that I'll be talking about today seeks to examine whether the deformation and strain regimes described by Highlander et al. In a macaque mandible are also observed in our FE models of the ape mandibles. So, the hypothesis I'll be addressing today is looking at whether the primary deformation and strain regimes in chimpanzee FEMs match those suggested by Highlander to explain the patterns of in vivo bone strain in macaques during mastication. And I'm going to assess these regionally. So I'll talk about the balancing side corpus, the working side corpus, and in the symphysis. And in the balancing side corpus, Highlander predicted sagittal bending and axial twisting, and I'll be addressing those. In the working side corpus, we'll be looking at sagittal bending, axial twisting. This is about the axis of the corpus. And also lateral transverse bending and sagittal shear. And then in the symphysis, we'll be looking for lateral transverse bending or wishboning, as well as frontal shear. This is just an overview of my methods, but I'm going to walk you through the steps one by one. So for our specimen selection, the specimen selection was based on work done by my colleague, Chris Robinson. 504 landmarks and semi-landmarks were digitized on surfaces derived from CT scans of 26 specimens of chimps. So we have 16 males and 10 females. The sample includes specimens from 3 subspecies of chimp. We have Pan-Troglodytes troglodytes, Troglodytes veris, and also Troglodytes schwannfurthii. The landmark coordinates were converted to shape coordinates by generalized Procustes analysis, and principal components analysis were used to determine the patterns of shape variation. So for this work, males and females were analyzed separately, and the male and female specimens that are closest to the mean centroid form were selected for our finite element modeling. Model creation involves many steps from the initial data acquisition through a complete finite element model. First, we used geometric morphometrics to select our specimens for modeling. Next, we compile stacks of CT scans to capture the morphological detail of a specimen. And during this phase, and in 3D editing, we can embed trabecular volumes or cavities that we captured from those CT data and refine and repair those surfaces before we proceed through the meshing process and applying material properties, loads, constraints, and running our linear static analyses. So what you can see here in this slide is a PC plot from our chimpanzee specimens. This is the software we use for segmentation, where we capture the morphology. Here's an example of 3D editing in geomagics with a modern human cranium aligned to a human FE model of a mandible. This is our meshing module. And then finally, this is our finite element model with some muscle vectors applied there just to show you that. So for material properties in these models, I have applied material properties of cortical bone and trabecular bone based on work done by Schwartz, Dabney, and Deco. I have used for these mandibles the mean value of craniofacial bone for great apes that was selected over these in these regional areas. In the future, we have collected these data on the mandible as well, but they're currently being processed. So for now, I've used the mean craniofacial data, and I will be applying regionally heterogeneous isotropic material properties when I update these. So the forces that we apply to the models represent the temporalis, the superficial and deep masseters, and the medial pterygoid. And the force magnitudes were estimated from muscle physiological cross-sectional area data. The PCSA data were obtained from dissection by chimpanzees done by Andrea Taylor. And the muscle forces were applied to the chimp models by scaling these physiological cross-sectional area values by bone volume to the 2/3. So I do that procedure to ensure that larger models experience larger forces. But the purpose of that is not to replicate the exact muscle force of each specimen. Rather, that scaling procedure allows me to eliminate size as a variable that would affect strains in the models. Therefore, the differences in the strains in our models only reflect differences in shape and don't reflect differences in size. So that allows us to compare relative performance between the models. By using the physiological cross-sectional data area, I'm also assuming that all of the muscles are operating at peak force or maximal bite. The muscle direction was estimated following techniques of Panagiotopoulou et al. By choosing cranial regions based on a surface file of crania that matched the mandible, finding the centroid of each of the origin and insertion areas, and then using the 3D coordinates to calculate muscle vector data. You can see here, this is an example of the area of the origin of the muscles, and here's an area of the insertion of the muscle, and we calculate the centroid for each of these, get the 3D coordinates, and then calculate the muscle vectors. The muscle insertion areas are selected nodally using photos from dissection, and we use them to guide our application of the forces. In sum, all of the nodal values that are applied to the chimp models, the sum of all the nodal forces applied to each model is equivalent to that total muscle force we calculated from PCSA. So the boundary conditions applied to the model in the working side TMJ are fixed in all directions. On the balancing side, the temporomandibular joint is fixed in X and Y, so that's superiorly and anteroposteriorly. And at an M1 bite point, I've constrained the model from translating in all directions. These are the boundary conditions that most closely replicate in vivo conditions in the FE models as reported by Panagiotopoulou et al. 2017. And here, just to orient you to that coordinate system, I've applied an anatomical coordinate system to each of the models. So our deformation is going to, and our strain regimes are going to be described in this anatomical coordinate system. So you can see that X positive is superior, Y positive is anterior, Z positive is to the left. Our axial strains will be described in the XX will be supero-inferior, YY is anteroposterior, ZZ is mediolateral. And when we talk about shear strains, we're talking about those occurring in named planes. So our XY plane is our sagittal plane, our YZ plane is our transverse plane, and our ZX plane is our coronal plane. And I just want to also describe these to you because we'll be talking about different types of bending, shear, and torsion. Positive bending results in superior concavity, and negative bending results in inferior, so you can see that there. Positive shear means that the corner of the element closest to the coordinate axis gets smaller. As you can see here, if you're thinking about this XZ axis, and conventionally positive shear is represented in red, and negative shear is the opposite of that, so it means that the corner of this element closest to the axis is getting larger, and it's traditionally or conventionally represented as blue. If we're talking about torsion, positive torsion is counterclockwise towards looking towards the origin, and negative torsion is clockwise looking towards the origin, such that if we're talking about the right corpus, E version of the right corpus results in negative torsion about that y-axis. So here are the two finite element models that we'll be talking about. On the left is the female chimp, and on the right is the male chimp. And each of these models, once meshed, had between 2.5 million and 3 million Tet4 brick elements. So I'm just going to describe the predictions for each of these regions, and then we'll walk through the results. So for the balancing side predictions, based on the in vivo strain, Highlander et al. Hypothesized that during unilateral biting, the balancing side corpus experiences sagittal bending and axial twisting. So here's a schematic to try to help familiarize you with that loading, deformation, and strain regimes that we'll expect. Superiorly directed vertical components of the jaw elevator muscles, the inferior directed reaction forces at the condyle and at the bite should result in negative sagittal bending. And we expect to find then tensile strains at the alveolar ridge and compressive strains at the mandibular base when we're looking at our strain regime. For axial twisting, given the loading conditions of inferiorly directed bite and balancing side joint reaction force and the resultant force of the jaw elevator muscles that falls laterally to the long axis of the corpus, we expect negative torsion about the y-axis so that the mandibular base is going to be everted and the tooth row will be inverted. That deformation regime should be associated with positive shear strain at the alveolar process and negative shear strain at the mandibular base. So let's evaluate each of these hypotheses regionally, starting with the balancing side, and I'm going to show you right now the deformation of those two models from posterior view, where I was. So for both models, can I get this to play again? Well, for both models, what we see is that the balancing side corpus and ramus are deforming laterally, and the mandibular base is everting, while the alveolar ridge deforms medially. I'll show you some still photos, since these are not moving. So here's that still photo, and you see the deformation of the models once our analysis has been completed. From the posterior view, we are looking at here the light blue is the original model, and the dark blue is the deformed model. The most distinctive deformation for me here is this eversion of the mandibular base as the angle is deformed laterally. It's pulled up and outward by the masseter muscle force. The tooth row is inverted, and the cornoid's deformed inward medially. That indicates negative torsion of the balancing side, of the working side corpus. The balancing side corpus. You can see the corpus, ramus, and angle are all deformed outward. That also suggests lateral transverse bending due to the lateral components of the balancing side muscle force. The ramus, the cornoid process, and the condyle are also deformed upwards by superiorly directed components of the jaw elevator muscles. Let's see if this plays again. If we watch the animation from the front, we should be able to see superior deformation of the condyle and negative torsion of the corpus and ramus as that mandibular base everts and the alveolar process inverts. This never plays when I plug it in, but always plays on my computer. So let's look at it laterally. We're looking at the deformation from the side here. Again, light blue is the original model, and dark blue is the deformed model. And we can see the corpus, ramus, and angle are all deformed laterally, suggesting lateral transverse bending. We know that because we see the dark here closest to us, and that light blue is more medially. So that tells us that the model has deformed laterally. You can also see the cornoid process and condyle have been pulled superiorly and medially. So what do the strain regimes tell us? Do they help corroborate what we see from the deformations and add to our understanding of how the model's behaving? Here we're looking at the YY antero-posterior strains in the sagittal plane. In both models, we can see this tension at the alveolar border and compression at the base of the mandible. And that indicates to me that we have negative sagittal bending going on caused by those inferiorly directed bite force being transferred across the symphysis and the superiorly directed components of the balancing side muscle force. Looking at the models from above and below, we can see those tensile YY strains again, superiorly on the balancing side corpus. We see tension here extending from the medial aspect of the ramus along the endocondylar crest, and we see compression from below at the base of the mandible. And again, this is evidence of negative sagittal bending. When we look at the shear strains, we see positive YZ strain along the superior aspect of the corpus and the endocondylar ridge, and that's associated with negative torsion of the balancing side corpus and ramus. We see negative YZ shear strain along the inferior aspect of the corpus, and that is, again, also associated with negative torsion of the balancing side corpus. So this has the effect of everting the mandibular base while inverting the tooth row. So during simulated biting, the balancing side corpus and ramus of both female and male chimpanzees show sagittal bending, yes, and axial twisting. We see negative torsion. And we also see evidence of lateral transverse bending and sagittal shear. What about on the working side? On the working side, we expect to see sagittal bending. We expect to see axial twisting, again, some torsion. We expect to see lateral transverse bending, and we also expect to see sagittal shear. So here's another schematic. We expect that anteriorly, the deformation regime will be such that sagittal bending, negative bending, occurs due to the external forces. This diagram should look pretty similar to the one that I showed for the balancing side. And if we focus on everything anterior to the working side muscle forces, we expect to see that positive sagittal bending here due to the loading regime that includes superiorly directed components of the balancing side muscle force that are transmitted across the symphysis, also inferiorly directed reaction force at the bite point, and superiorly directed components of the working side muscle forces. But there's more going on the working side because we have 4 points of loading rather than 3 as we had on the balancing side. So given that, we expect to see a shift from positive sagittal bending anteriorly along the corpus to negative sagittal bending posteriorly along the ramus. So this should occur due to the superiorly directed muscle forces acting between the bite point and the condyle. So that positive to negative reversal should lead to a reversal of the relative position of tensile to compressive strains in the ramus and the corpus. Highlander also reports axial twisting on the working side, but the direction of the torsion is variable, saying that in some cases, the lateral aspect experiences tensile stress, while the medial aspect experiences compressive stress, which would indicate torsion. But in other instances, the pattern is reversed. So this diagram shows the mirror deformation of the balancing side and would be supported by negative transverse shear in the alveolar ridge here, and an inversion of that and positive transverse shear at the mandibular base. And also, if we're looking at lateral transverse bending, we expect that the laterally directed components of the muscle forces and the bite force would act on the working side corpus and ramus to have the effect of pulling the rami laterally, and that would result in compression on the buccal aspect of the corpus and tension on the lingual aspect. So what do we see? If we look at our animation again and evaluate the working side this time, we can see the female on the left and again the male on the right. And in both models, the working side corpus and ramus are deforming in the same direction as the balancing side, rather than mirroring them. So actually what we're seeing on the working side is that the mandibular base is inverting while the alveolar ridge is everting. So I'll show you a still because I'm not showing you an animation. Here is a still of that in posterior view, and again, light blue original and dark blue is deformed. So we see that the working side, corpus, angle, and ramus are being deformed medially in both the models, and that indicates some medial transverse bending. And also the base is slightly inverted rather than everted. Here's a still looking at them from superior view. And when you look down in the models like this, we can see the medial displacement of the coronoid, the ramus, and the posterior corpus, including the posterior tooth row and alveolar ridge. But we also see a slight elevation of the coronoid process relative to the condyle, which suggests that there's negative sagittal bending in the posterior corpus and ramus. Anteriorly along the tooth row, however, there's a slight elevation, and that suggests that there is positive sagittal bending in the anterior portion of the tooth row as predicted. So looking at them in lateral view, it's not totally clear from this deformation that there's sagittal bending here, but rather we can really see that medial deflection of the molar tooth row and corpus, as we see that our dark blue is located medially to our wireframe, which is our original model. So do the strain results suggest sagittal bending? Looking again at this YY anteroposterior axial strain in the sagittal plane in both models, we see compression at the alveolar ridge in both and tension at the mandibular base. So it's apparent that although there is sagittal bending in the corpus around the bite point, presumably caused by that inferiorly directed force transmitted across the symphysis, that inferiorly directed bite force and superiorly directed components of the working side jaw elevators. But what about the prediction of the reversal in the direction of sagittal bending? And although we have tension along the condylar neck, here and here, there are high compressive strains along most of the buccal aspect of the working ramus. If we look at the models from the superior views, we see that the YY axial strains on the top of the corpus are negative anteriorly and around the bite point as associated with positive bending, but then they shift to positive YY strains posteriorly around the retromolar sulcus, and that's associated with negative bending. If we look at them from inferior, we see the YY sagittal strains are positive anteriorly along the corpus and shift to negative when they're more posterior around the angle. So what might explain the diffuse compression on the buccal aspect of the posterior corpus and ramus? If we look at the deformation again, it can help us to understand that. The working side corpus and ramus are being pulled medially by the laterally directed components of the balancing side muscle force transmitted across the symphysis. And if that's true, we also expect to see tensile strains on the lingual aspect. And so in posterior view, it does look that, although somewhat diffuse, there is tension along much of the lingual aspect of the corpus and ramus. So that pattern of YY axial strains is consistent with a superposition of sagittal bending and medial transverse bending on the working side. So if we look at the animations again from the front, we can see the medial transverse bending, and it looks like the mandibular base is inverting slightly, while the anterior postcanine tooth row is slightly rotating outwards. So is there twisting on the working side? If we look at the strains, we can see that positive YZ shear strain along the superior aspect of the corpus is associated with negative torsion of the working side corpus, and negative XY shear along the inferior aspect of the corpus is also associated with negative torsion of the working side corpus. So negative torsion has the effect of inverting the mandibular base and slightly everting the anterior dentition. And the posterior dentition is deformed medially due to medial transverse bending. So what about sagittal shear in the working side? Anterior to the bite point, positive shears are associated with vertical components of balancing side muscle force, and negative shears are associated with bite reaction forces. The bite reaction force is increasingly resisted by the working side muscles posteriorly on the ramus as shear becomes positive. So for a strain regime, we expect to see positive shear between the balancing side muscle force coming across the symphysis to the bite point, and then we expect to see negative shear between the bite point and the jaw elevator muscles, and then positive shear between the working side muscles and the joint reaction force. And that would result in positive, negative, and positive shear. So if we look at those strain results and the shear results, here we're looking at the sagittal strains on the buccal aspect. This is not, we're looking at the shear strains on the buccal aspect of the working side corpus and ramus. And we can see that the shear is associated with a sagittal bending regime, which leads to anterior to the bite point, we're seeing shear strains are positive. Just behind the bite point, we have those negative shear strains. And then posterior further, we have positive shear strains as the jaw elevator muscles sum and act on points posterior to the insertion. So during stimulating biting, what I'm finding is that the working side corpus and ramus of both male and female chimps are showing signs of sagittal bending, axial twisting, medial transverse bending rather than lateral, and sagittal shear. Finally, we look at the symphysis. We're looking for lateral transverse bending or wishboning and frontal shear. So wishboning should result from the combination of laterally directed muscle forces acting on the working side teeth. Laterally directed muscle forces acting on the mandible, and then the laterally directed bite force acting on the working side teeth. Those laterally directed working side superficial masseter is acting on the working side ramus, and the laterally directed balancing side superficial masseter is also working on the mandible. And we expect compression on the labial aspect of the mandible, of the corpus symphysis, and tension lingually. So here's a still of the deformation where we can see the symphysis. We're looking at it posteriorly again. And again, that light blue is the original model, and the dark blue is the deformed model. The most distinctive deformation to me here is some lateral transverse bending of the medial side and medial transverse bending of the working side. But what does it tell us about the symphysis? What can we see from the strains? So we expect our ZZ medial-lateral tension at the lingual aspect of the symphysis to be positive, but there's clearly some compression here. So the blue indicates compression and the red indicates tension. We see some compression on the symphysis here and on the alveolar ridge and superior transverse torus. Why is that? Well, perhaps the negative torsion on the balancing side is superimposed on a wishboning regime. So we have internal force that's transmitted across the symphysis, and the lower edge of the mandibular base is slightly everting, and resulting tension at the inferior transverse torus, as well as compression at the superior transverse torus. Looking at it from a frontal view, we see some compression, as we'd expect. A little bit of blue or green here, but really not much. It doesn't appear that wishboning is the only thing that's happening here. What about frontal shear? So frontal shear at the symphysis is hypothesized to be due to the superior components of the jaw elevator muscles, elevating that balancing side, and the inferior components of the bite force depressing the working side. This would cause an upward shearing deformation of the balancing side relative to the working side, and we expect to see negative frontal shear at the buccal aspect of the symphysis. So what can we see going on at the symphysis from the animations? Not a whole lot, except that we do see that the balancing side of the mandible is elevated relative to the depression of the working side, which would cause frontal shear, should cause frontal shear on the buccal aspect of the symphysis. So we can look at that, we can look at the strains more closely. Here's a still that shows the deformation in the anterior view. And the most distinctive deformation to me is actually a tilting of the anterior dentition. It's inferiorly on the working side and elevation on the balancing side. Let's look at the strains. Is there negative shear actually at the buccal aspect of the symphysis? Well, there is negative shear at the buccal aspect of the symphysis. As that balancing side is being pulled up and the working side is pushed down, we see negative shear. And if we look at frontal shear on the lingual aspect of the symphysis, we also see evidence of negative torsion of the working and balancing side corpora, and that's associated with positive frontal shear at the lingual symphysis. So, to summarize what we see at the symphysis, we do see frontal shear and also wishboning. So, in conclusion, the primary deformation and strain regimes in the chimpanzee FE models do generally match most of the predictions by Highlander to explain the patterns of in vivo bone strain in macaques during mastication. In the balancing side, we do see sagittal bending and axial twisting, plus we also see lateral transverse bending and sagittal shear. And in the working side corpus, we see sagittal bending, we see axial twisting, we see medial rather than lateral transverse bending and sagittal shear. And in the symphysis, we see that wishboning, and we do see frontal shear. So, what will we do with this in the future? As we move forward, I will continue to assess the loading, deformation, and strain regimes of the rest of the grape apes while simulating different types of loading behaviors to see if those follow similar deformation and strain regimes as the work that's previously been done. I'll compare these to each other and ask whether there are species-specific patterns. And we're looking to see whether we can map those differences and similarities in strain pattern on the differences and similarities that we see in our geometric morphometric analysis. So, and as we continue to develop models of the fossils from CT scans and reconstructions, we can use what we know about patterns of mechanical performance in extant apes to help us understand the morphological differences that we see in fossil specimens. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Amanda, for the talk. Any question?
To what extent do you think these mechanical strains can influence bone remodeling during, let's say, mandibular growth or even during aging?
I don't know, but that's a really good question, and I think that there are some people here working on those types of things and looking at how the strain patterns change and the deformation patterns change during growth, during ontogeny, is one of the questions that we're really interested in exploring, both in fossils, because we have juveniles, and also, of course, in modern humans as well. So I don't know, but I'd like to.
Can I ask another question?
Of course.
During your talk, I was just wondering if the presence of developing teeth inside mandible or maxilla could change this pattern. Actually, I was thinking, I went even further, if those strains could influence on tooth eruption, whose mechanism is not well known yet. I know it's just, maybe this would be, Felippe knows the answer, I don't know. You said yes?
It's a really good question. I also do not know the answer. But yeah, certainly that, one would imagine it could.
We have to dentition, I think would be a nice model and try to answer those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. Yeah, very good question.
Hey, Amanda, I have a question. Like, we have here in the dental school, like, when we try to give a lecture of anatomy about the biomechanics of the mandible, we give a lecture like try to let the students to understand that the mandible has only one type of stress regime in the mandible. And this, I think, this start with Cesar and Dubrow in 1948. I'm not sure about that. But when I saw the results and your finite element analysis, and we can see that is completely different, and we have a complex system of different regimes in the mandible. But you are talking about the great apples. I don't know if this happens in humans or don't, but if yes, is a good idea to find how to bring this to the gross anatomy and give the opportunity for the student to understand how these regimes happens. I don't know if you know if this happens in humans or don't. I'm not sure.
Well, I will know soon, but I suspect that it does. So one of the ways that traditionally, or the way that I have looked at strain in the past has been looking at patterns of von Mises strain, for example, where we're looking at all of the strains combined. When we look at our axial strains individually, for example, if we look at just strains in the sagittal planes, or we look at just shear in the transverse planes, that gives us a chance to be able to tease apart the different types of deformation patterns and the different types of strains caused by those different deformation patterns. And what we're finding is that the regimes are more complicated than we thought, and the deformation is there are several different types of deformation that are superimposed upon each other, and they give us those patterns that, without breaking them down, we wouldn't really know what was going on. So, yeah, there's a lot happening.
No more questions? So, Amanda, we are grateful for your lecture. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your lecture. We learned a lot about finite element analysis and all the stress patterns. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, certificate for you. Nós agora teremos a próxima palestra com o professor Felippe. The next lecture is Professor Felippe. Então, passo a palavra para o Felippe, então.
Okay. Hi guys. I need to be honest. I'm I'm not so comfortable to talk in English, you know, but I'm not sure if I have to try or not. I'm still not sure. Okay. Yes, I need to decide, and I cannot do that. Okay. So I'm gonna try in English, you know. Okay. Okay, Sergio. Go ahead. Okay. So my name is Felippe. I'm professor, anatomy professor here in University of Campinas, Piracicaba Dental School, and I'm gonna talk a little about the finite element models in captive mandibles. Okay. And why we study finite element models? Before I go to Chicago, and I was working with finite element model with Alexandre and Anna here in Piracicaba, and we have a different idea about the finite element model before go to Chicago. And after come back to Chicago, come back from Chicago, and our idea changed a little bit about that. Like, I love the presentation of Amanda, and I think that finite element model is a portal to understand the biomechanics, and I don't work with vertebrate paleontology, but it's a good tool for that too. And I think that the finite element model is one of the best tools to generate hypotheses about the biomechanics. Before work with that, we use the finite element model just to understand how the strain regimes and the stress regimes works. But I think that with finite element, we can create some hypotheses about that. And after stay with Professor Callum Ross in his lab, I saw the in vivo analysis, and now I know how they work with finite element model. It's a little bit different from how we worked here before know this analysis. And I think that the precision and accuracy of the finite element models, I think for bone geometry and muscle force and bone conditions, and they get like tissue materials from Paul Decaux and the materials from Andrea Taylor, and before that we didn't have that idea about the finite element models. And why caputins? Why cibus? Cibus has, I think cibus is one of the important, maybe the important types of living to understand the human biomechanical system. And is a good model to try to understand the biomechanics. It's a little bit different from the humans, but it's very close. And here in Brazil, we don't have opportunity to understand the biomechanics studying cibus like you guys has in the United States. But we have the opportunity to understand the biomechanics here in the wood and like in free site. So, and the cibus has the behavior of the mandible close to the human, and it's a little bit different from what we work here. We work with rats, and rats is completely different from the human, because we cannot do the research like you guys can do in the United States. But that's why we try to understand the cibus now, the cibus mandible. And here is, we have this both model, like the school of civils and the school of humans, and we can see they are not like similar, but they have the behavior like very close from one each other. And why mandibles? If we look to the mandible, we can see that the mandible, they have more, they suffer like, it suffer more influence from the external force and the internal force, like the teeth or muscles, than the skull. So I think is to understand how the mandible changes or not, and with force, external or internal force, I think is one of the best model and better. I think it's better than the school to understand the behavior and the biomechanics. Okay, so the final element, we try to understand the biomechanics of the mandible of Caputin's. Our objectives are create a specific finite element models of Caputin's mandibles and load and validate using in vivo data from the same animal. This happens, like I said before, I didn't have this idea before know the Professor Callum's lab. And when I arrived in Chicago, I have no idea about that we can take the in vivo data and match the in vivo data with the in silico data, right? And this research was my postdoc research. I think it's the first time I'm giving this presentation here, Sergio. I think the first time. And another objective was evaluate the impact of the type of food on model behavior and access the impact of bite point on the model behavior. It's a little bit different from the research from Amanda. No, we are not trying to understand the stress and strain regimes in the mandible. We just try to compare. But I think we can do that in the future. So here is the mole model, right, Callum? So now the steps of the model creation. The first was when I arrived in Chicago, the model was done. I think it was Courtney that worked in this model before I arrived. So, but the steps, they are the same. They got the CT scan and they made the transformations of the geometric into a discrete finite element, create the mesh, and assign the tissue material properties and the boundary conditions. And I will talk a little bit about that in the next slides. So here is the material properties we received from a friend of Professor Callum from University of Houston, right? Baylor University, yes. And this step was new for me too, because here we took the material properties in the literature and not from the animal. So this was new for me. And Paul Nicole sent to Callum all the material properties, all for the Callum lab, and we insert this in the model to solve the model. And the model was created with all these types of material properties. You can see that they took like all these sites and get the information of the bacterial properties of all these sites. So now we create the 3D model and insert the loads and constraints and create the mesh. To load the model, we receive all the data from Andrea Taylor about the muscles of the capuchins and physiological cross-sectional area, and the EMG data came from Pepe, right? Right, Pepe? Pepe and both. Pepe, Carlo, and Andre, right? So the next step was to create, to make the simulations of the model. And here we have, like, just an example, the model after solved. And what was new for me was this, that we receive, after solve the model, we try to match the model with in vivo analysis, like here, and I will show you in the next steps. Okay, here is the model, and these sides of the model we insert like the is the region when we insert the muscles force to generate the analysis. Oh, sorry. And here is, this is the figure where we have all the muscles force that we insert in the model. And you can see that they collect the data from different types of variables, like biting on the right, on the left side, from different types of fruits. And they send for me these informations in the lab to solve the model. And this was crazy too. The Callum had like a program, the name is OneLoad, where you just insert the number of the force, and the force is all set. We never know if where's the force and nothing. I think it's like some kind of programming, right, Callum? Yes, and we don't have this program right now. I think it's gone, right? Yes. So, but it's a great software because we can put, like, if you give the exactly orientation and the positions of the bone and the insertion and the origin of the muscles, he gives the exactly force of the muscles, and this is all can be generated and all set in the model. Yes, in the model restrains, and here we use like 5 different bite positions to restrain the model. We use the incisors, we use left and right premolar bite point, we use left and right molar bite points. And in all the cases, the right side of the finite element model was the working side, and the left side was the balanced side. Like I said, was a little bit different from the study of the Amanda. We tried to match the in vivo with in silico analysis in this case. And here we have in this folder like all the models. We create like 25 models, and we have a lot of variations between the models. We try to get the same situation the Professor Callum and Pepe got in the in vivo analysis. That's why we did like a lot of model in this case. So we solved those models in the strand, and using the implicit direct static solver in this kind of computer in the Callum's lab. And this was new for me too. I never had worked with strain before the Callum's lab. I think it's a great software to get the results. It's a little bit strange in the beginning, but it is okay. Oh, sorry. And here is, we have now the lateral view of all the models of the finite element Kapteyn's mandible. And what we did was changing the type of the fruit and the bite position. For example, here in the first figure, we have the incisor. And here we have, I think it's brick strain. I think this is not stress. It's a little bit different from the stress. And what we can see that if we change, in all the models, if we change the bite position, we have like a little difference between all those models. And I think we can try to understand just a little bit about what Amanda was talking about, the different regimes in this mandible too. Because we have a very similar situations of what type of regimes we have here in this area, like in the, I think it's trigonal, in the molar trigonal, right? Yes. And we have a very similar regime of deformation in the symphysis too. But this is just changing the bite position, right? So, then, okay. When we got all this model, I sent the results to this guy. He's the man. To Pepe. And I sent a lot. Right, Pepe? Okay, I sent the result to Pepe. And Pepe, what Pepe made. Before that, Professor Callum and I, we try to, like you can see here, we have the position, the exactly position of the strain gauge that Callum and Pep got in the in vivo analysis, right? It's that. And what we try to do is insert the finite element model, the mole finite element model, insert and match, try to get this site nearby the in vivo analysis and send this result to Pepe. Okay? So we had like a upper lateral, I think, gauge side, lower lateral gauge side, and we have like a medial gauge side. When I send to Pepe this result, Pepe send this result for me and Callum. And here we have like, it's like we can see in these pictures the effect of the bite location in E1 and E2 maximum and minimum strain, right? So when that's what I was talking with Pepe. I'm not sure what or what is the best model that match with the in vivo data. I don't know yet. But when we look to the incisor, like the effect of the incisor, we can see that the upper and the lower lateral gauge site, they have difference between the E1 and E2 strain regimes. And the medial gauge side is completely different from the both. But this, if I change the slide, look what we can see, sorry, so, wow. Hey, sorry about that. Yes. Right. Bem. Não tá indo. Abrir de novo. Vou fechar. Ok. Parece que tem um vírus aqui com. Parece que tem um vírus. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, that's I was talking when we change the effect of the bite point in the mandible. It looks like we have different situations between the different bite points. Like in this model. Like in the first model, we have the orientation, this orientation from the E1 and E2, right? And in the lower gauge side, we have is completely different from the first model, right? And here we have like the same situation from the first, like from this one. So. And if we look to the left molar, and we have is very similar the left molar. The effects in the mandibles, they are very similar, but the molar has like I think the intensity of the A1 I think is more than the molar, right? And when we change to the right side of the mandible, we have the same situation. The premolar and the molar, they have different orientations of the E1 and E2, and they have different intensities too. But this gauge site, like the medial gauge site, it still keeps the same orientations from the other one. Even we change the bite position. And when we change like to right molar, if we compare with the right premolar with right molar, we have this, like the intensity is just the variable that change between both, and doesn't change like the orientation then of the both gauge sides. So what we can conclude from the bite points, first is that if we change the bite point constraint, we have like effect on the strain magnitudes of the gauge site, like bring it the principal strain magnitudes in the range of the in vivo results. And the premolar bite point, it has more influence in the A1 magnitudes all at the all gauge sites than molars and incisor bites. So this information was new for me. I didn't have idea that this happens when when we change the bite points during mastigation. And the next step, I think, was to try to change the type of fruits. Like we had like more types of fruit, but we just use the nuts and dry fruits for the monkeys. And when Pepe sent the result for us, we can the first thing that I noted was that the intensity of the E1 was less than when we changed just the bite point without fruits, right? But the orientations of the E1 and E2 are the same, even we change the fruits, right? So even change the bite point, even maintain the bite points, and change the fruits, we don't have. If you look at the results, they are very similar between both and just and the fruit. Even tend to premolar, molar, right premolar, they are the same. They just like they keep the same orientation, and there's no much like change in the intensity between them. So what we can conclude about that is that what is the effect of chewing different foods? In this case, it's like nuts and dry. Is that nuts generate more tension and compression in mandibular body than dry fruits, but the directions of the variables are almost the same. They keep the orientation in this case. And the type of fruit does not change the strain's orientation, but the bite point does change. I think the paper, the rhesus monkey paper, it says like the exactly the same, but the models, they have some difference between this one, right, Callum? And the upper gauge side has more strain variations and intensity than the other strain gauge side. I'm not sure, but I think that must be because the positions of this gauge side. I'm not sure about that, Callum. If it's that by the position nearby the teeth, I don't know. Okay? And some question is, what drives the mandibular morphology? This is a difficult question to try to understand, but I put this view is that if we look all the types of all the variations of the capuchin's mandible, and we can find different morphologies even between the capuchins and the cebus monkeys. They have a lot of variations in the morphology. This is just an example of two types of the capuchins, the cebus and sapajos. But we have more. We have more types of capuchins. And this is another idea that I'm in talk with Professor Callum. And does the mandibular stress trajectories exist? We made a paper about that in the school, about the existence or not of the pillars, and we would like to do the same in the mandible, because we have the same concept in the mandible. And Pepe is working in the same place when this guy started this idea, right, Pepe? It's Dubru, right? Seashare Dubru, right? Yes, I remember the lab of this guy. But I'm not telling that this guy are wrong. It's not this. I just want to say that we have other technologies to try to understand that, right? It's a little bit different. So, and yes, I put this because I like this information. The size and the shape of skull bones are not adapted to minimize stress and strain and associate with different regimes. Before go to Chicago, I didn't know. I'm not sure if I know something now, but I didn't know about the strain regimes, and now I'm trying to understand what is this. But still has some important relationship between bone strain magnitudes and the design, and maybe this happens in mandible too, but we still don't know. But this is a good information here. And the variations of bone, the size and shape in some areas, like if you look to the Amanda, the finite element, we can see that we have a lot of information there. And it's like to be related to feed behavior, because some areas of cranial experience bone strain of low magnitudes during feeding and are not adapted to resistant feed force. So I think this is a good point to thinking about. So I'm really sorry for my English. Okay? And yes, that's it. Thank you so much.
So the patterns of strain in the capuchin mandible vary a lot with bite point, but they don't vary very much when they're chewing different foods.
Yes.
Have you looked at the rat mandible to see if the same thing happens in the rat? I mean, is this a universal? Is it something you see in other mammals as well, or is it? Do you think it's peculiar to the capuchin mandible?
Rats. Hats. Rats. Hats. Rats. Okay. We are trying to understand what's happened in the rats, okay? And we don't have these informations about about the muscles force and about the bone material properties, but we have some information about the strain regimes, and is different from the musculoskeletal. So, but we would like to understand the rats, because the rats, they are the model we have here to do our research. We have the monkeys too, but it's a little bit different. Okay, thank you, Callum.
Felippe, good job. I think you did it very well. Everybody understood your English perfectly. I was, again, just wondering, when you look at the mandibula, you see like it's a very thick bone. It's a kind of boring, more or less, in the body of mandibula. You have a thick cortical bone, the teeth, and not much spongy bone inside. But when you look at the maxilla, you see a more variable picture, I think. You have a zygomatic bone, you have the sinuses and everything. Would you think, do you think if you had looked at the maxilla, would you have seen more differences when you compare the positions of biting?
Thank you, Sergio. I'm still. I really don't know if we change the bite point in the maxilla, we can have the same results. But I agree that maxilla it has a lot of particulars, anatomy structures, and is a little bit is different from the mandible. We have more. We have sinuses. We have this, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you did some research with maxilla, Callum. No. Yes, we try to understand the existence of the pillars, but we did not find some information that the pillar really exists in the structurally and functionally. We have some information about the canine pillar and in Neanderthals, right? Neanderthals and humans, but it's like it's not uniform. The spaces of the strain regimes are not like uniform. It's like the mandible, I think, but we still don't know, sir. It's a good question.
Eu vou falar em português. Você já ouviu falar a respeito do modelo gnatostático, que é utilizado na ortopedia? Nós utilizamos esse modelo para avaliar o crescimento e desenvolvimento de base óssea, e tem é um cubo gnatofórico, onde ele é simetrografado, calcografado, e o crucifixo dessa calcografia mostra exatamente o centro de força mastigatória que se dá nos premolares. Depois a gente pode conversar um pouquinho, é interessante.
Hi, Felippe, again. I don't know, maybe I didn't see in your slides, but do you have some information about the toughness degree of nuts, dry fruits, or soft foods? And do you have some correlation with this toughness degree with bite force in primates?
Thank you, Carla. I don't have this information. I know that there are some information in the literature about that, and this is a good question, because if we put that, I don't know. Your question is that if we put some, or if we put this information in the finite element model, we will have some change in the model, right? Yes. I don't know.
It's possible to get the toughness degree in fruits.
Yes. No. Yes. I think it's possible because Alexandre and I and Anna, we are working with rats, and we put some interference, that's the term, in the between the tooths, the teeth, and we can see like some difference in the strain regime, in the patterns of the strain, and maybe this can be the same. I don't know. I don't have this question yet. It's a good question.
What is dry fruit in this? Yes.
How can I say it? It's like fruit. Yes. Seca. Fruta seca. Yes. Yes. What was Damasco? What was Pepe? Mix. Yes. Mix of fruits. For the monkeys. Okay. Questions? It's okay? Okay. Thank you. Okay, we have now a lunchtime, and we back here 2 p.m. Okay? Okay, thank you.